What in the ever-loving hell do you think you're doing, sprawling like a whore in my wife's bed?" Damian Blackwood's voice didn't just break the silence. It detonated it, ripping through the hushed stillness of the Aspen estate like shrapnel. He was a specter in the doorway, his massive frame radiating a fury so pure it was practically a physical force, each line of his handsome face chiseled into a mask of raw, visceral disgust. Melted snow dripped from the shoulders of his $1,000 coat, pooling on the antique floorboards. But he was oblivious, a man consumed by a singular scorching fire. His entire world, his entire universe of rage, was laser-focused on the woman recoiling from the center of his marital bed. Aurora Jensen. Her name was a whisper, but his glare was a scream. She shot up, the luxurious sheets falling away, her heart jackhammering against her ribs not with guilt, but with a tidal wave of gut-wrenching shock. Flanking her, like two small, shipwrecked sailors, his twin sons, Leo and Noah, remained lost in the first peaceful sleep they'd had in months. Their 5-year-old faces, usually tight with anxiety, were slack with dreams, their chests rising and falling in a deep, even rhythm. A worn, one-eyed giraffe was tucked under Leo's arm, a silent, threadbare guardian. What would you do if you walked into a scene like this? Before you cast your judgment, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this story is about to systematically dismantle every single assumption you have about right, wrong, and the shattered pieces in between. I can explain. Aurora's voice was a desperate, quiet plea, terrified of waking the very children she was trying to protect. Her hands rose in a gesture of surrender, palms open, a beacon of calm in a hurricane of rage. They were terrified. Noah had a nightmare, and Leo started getting a nosebleed from the stress. Damian didn't let her finish. The truth was irrelevant. His grief was a blind, rabid animal, and it had just been let off its leash. His hand, the same hand that signed multi-million-dollar deals without a tremor, moved with sickening speed. The sound it made, a sharp, percussive crack as his open palm connected with her cheek, was an obscenity in the sacred quiet of the room. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a gunshot in a cathedral. Aurora staggered, a choked gasp escaping her lips as her hand flew to her face, the imprint of his fingers already blooming like a poisoned flower against her skin. She didn't scream. She didn't even cry out. Her wide, hazel eyes simply locked on his, the shock of the physical blow paling in comparison to the utter bewilderment churning within her. "I don't give a damn what pathetic excuse you've cooked up," Damian growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "You're fired. Get your trash out of my house, now." For a long, suspended moment, she remained perfectly still, her hand pressed to her burning cheek, the metallic taste of blood on her tongue. She took a ragged breath, trying to steady the world that was spinning violently around her. When her voice finally emerged, it was barely a whisper, a fragile thread of sound. "They begged me not to leave them alone. I promised them I would stay until they felt safe, until the monsters went away." He sneered, his lip curling in contempt. "I said, get out." Aurora's gaze drifted one last time to the boys, so blissfully unaware, so deeply asleep, as if the shadows that had relentlessly haunted their young lives had finally, blessedly, receded. She leaned over, her movements fluid and tender, and pressed a ghost of a kiss to Noah's temple, then to Leo's forehead. No fanfare, no dramatic pronouncements. She just absorbed the sight of their peace, etching it into her memory. Then, with a quiet dignity that was a direct affront to his brutish rage, she stepped away from the bed, scooped her worn sneakers from the floor, and walked past him without another word, without another glance. He stood, rigid and unmoving, a statue of regret he hadn't yet begun to feel. He didn't stop her. He certainly didn't apologize. Downstairs in the grand foyer, the warm light caught the raw, red mark on her cheek. Mrs. Albright, the head housekeeper, a woman who had seen the Blackwood family through birth and death, turned from polishing a silver console table. Her kind eyes widened, first in confusion, then in dawning horror. She saw the mark, saw the silent devastation in Aurora's eyes, and understood everything in an instant. The older woman opened her mouth to speak, but Aurora gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No words were needed. The violence had spoken for itself. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world cloaked in a pristine, unforgiving white. Aurora stepped into the crisp, cold afternoon, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shivering frame as she began the long walk down the winding driveway toward the imposing iron gates. Back upstairs, Damien stood in the master bedroom, his breathing still harsh and uneven. He glared at the bed, his jaw so tight he could hear his teeth grinding. And then, a sound pierced his rage-filled haze, or rather, a lack of it. Silence. Not the tense, waiting silence he was used to, but a deep, profound quiet. He moved closer to the bed, drawn by a force he couldn't name. Leo's brow was smooth, untroubled by the usual frantic tossing and whimpered pleas. Noah's thumb, his constant comfort, was tucked in his mouth, but his little body was still, completely relaxed against the pillows. They were asleep. Not the drugged-like exhaustion that followed a screaming fit, not the fretful dozing that was easily broken. This was true restorative sleep, his throat constricted. 22 nannies, countless therapists, child psychologists, sleep specialists, a Rolodex of the best minds money could buy, hours upon hours of inconsolable screaming, night terrors, and soul-crushing anxiety that had turned his home into a waking hell since his wife, Isabella, had been torn from their lives. And yet, this woman, this soft-spoken stranger with sad eyes and a quiet strength, had accomplished in weeks what none of them had in 2 years. And he had struck her for it. He had branded her a whore and thrown her out into the cold. He collapsed onto the edge of the vast bed, his head falling into his hands. A venomous shame, hot and corrosive, bled into his chest, spreading like ink through water. It was a poison he had created, and now he was drowning in it. On the nightstand, where Isabella's picture used to be, lay a single sheet of paper, folded once. His hand trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and steady. If you can't be present for them in their storm, at least don't push away the one person willing to stand in the rain with them. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. He read it once, twice, a third time. His own reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the bedside lamp. A man hollowed out by grief, ossified by the need for control, choking on a silence of his own making. Down the hall, Mrs. Albright stood watching from the doorway, her presence a silent, unwavering accusation. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "She didn't touch a single thing in here. She only brought them in when little Leo's nosebleed wouldn't stop. The blood was getting on his pillow, and it was frightening him." He didn't respond, the note clutched in his hand. "She stayed because they asked her to," Mrs. Albright continued, her words precise and damning. "That is all. They didn't ask for you. They don't ask for anyone else anymore. Just her." Damien looked up, his eyes dark, the fury now replaced by something far heavier, something that looked terrifyingly like regret. Outside, the distant squeak of the main gate closing echoed through the silent house. And for the first time in 2 long, agonizing years, the Blackwood mansion was utterly silent. But it wasn't the silence of grief or rage. It was the crushing, empty silence of peace, the kind Aurora had brought with her, and the kind she had just taken away. The silence that followed was a physical entity. It wasn't the comforting hush of a library or the peaceful quiet of early dawn. This was a malignant quiet, a void where life used to be, the sound of a wound festering. Damien Blackwood sat entombed in his leather and mahogany study, a crystal glass of untouched Macallan sweating beside him on the antique desk. Aurora's note lay there like a writ of execution, its simple words a judgment more severe than any court could deliver. If you can't be present for them in their storm, at least don't push away the one person willing to stand in the rain with them. He'd read it until the ink seemed to bleed into his own vision. Outside, dusk draped a heavy velvet cloak over the snow-covered Rockies, and the wind whispered against the bulletproof windows like a mournful ghost. Upstairs, his sons slept on, blissfully ignorant of the storm inside their father, oblivious to the fact that the one person who had finally managed to anchor their tiny, fragile boats in a sea of grief was now gone, cast out by the very man who should have been their lighthouse. Damien leaned his head back against the worn leather of his chair, the scent of old books and older whiskey doing nothing to soothe him. He rubbed his temples, his right hand still carrying a phantom sting, the ghost of the impact, a permanent stain on his soul. He hadn't meant to. He hadn't planned it. It wasn't the man he thought he was, the controlled, disciplined titan of industry. And yet, the muscle memory was there. It had happened. A single catastrophic moment of misplaced fury, born from an ocean of unspeakable grief, and 1,000 quiet, daily failures as a father. He had hit a woman, a defenseless woman, a woman who had been helping his children. He stood so abruptly that the heavy chair scraped against the floor, a sound of protest in the suffocating stillness. He made his way upstairs, his polished shoes silent on the plush runner. The hallway outside the boys' nursery smelled faintly of chamomile and clean linen, a scent he now recognized as hers. A small wooden stool, one she often sat on while reading to them, was pressed against the wall. Atop it, left behind in her haste, was her sketchbook. Closed, neat, as if she had left it there knowing he would find it. He picked it up, the cheap cardboard cover feeling alien in his hands. He opened it. The pages were filled not with landscapes or portraits, but with simple, raw pencil drawings, technically untrained, but vibrating with an undeniable heart. Two small boys, holding hands as they faced a monstrous, shadowy figure that looked disturbingly like him. A towering mansion with too many dark windows and no door. And on the final page, a sketch of a woman, her face indistinct, sitting on the floor between the two boys, her arms stretched out around them like protective wings. Beneath it, in her clean, looping script, a single caption: "The one who stays." He exhaled, a long, ragged breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. In the nursery, Noah stirred, a small whimper escaping his lips. Damien peered inside. The boy rolled over, his face scrunching for a moment, but then, miraculously, he settled again. No screams, no frantic calls for a mother who would never answer. He closed the door with a softness he rarely possessed. Downstairs, Mrs. Albright was methodically polishing silver in the vast, sterile kitchen. She looked up as Damien entered, and her hands stilled. Something in his expression, a deep, hollowed-out brokenness, told her this was not a time for pleasantries. "She's gone," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "I know, sir," she replied, her tone perfectly neutral, offering neither comfort nor condemnation. "I made a mistake," he said, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. Mrs. Albright finally set the silver polish aside, her eyebrows raising a fraction of an inch. "You don't say." She was in my bed, my wife's bed. She was in your room, Mrs. Albright corrected, her voice gentle but firm. Because the boys refused to sleep anywhere else. You weren't here, sir. I was. I heard them crying, begging her not to leave. She calmed them. She sang to them until their breathing evened out. He pressed his lips into a thin white line. I know precisely what you thought, sir, she said, her gaze unwavering. But the problem is you weren't thinking. You were just reacting. Silence descended between them, heavy and suffocating. He stared at the empty chair at the small kitchen table, where Aurora had eaten her simple meals, always insisting on eating with the staff rather than in the formal dining room. It felt like an eternity ago. I need to find her, he said finally, a desperate urgency creeping into his voice. Mrs. Albright didn't argue. She simply wiped her hands on her apron. Start with the employment agency. Her application would have a forwarding address. Somewhere in southern Georgia, I believe. Phooey. Georgia, he repeated, already turning and heading for the hall, the name of a place as foreign to him as the idea of redemption. Miles away, in a grimly lit bus station in Denver, Aurora Jensen sat alone on a hard plastic bench. Her cheek throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that was a pale imitation of the one in her chest. She hadn't cried. Not when he screamed at her. Not when the blow landed. Not even when she walked through those cold iron gates with nothing but her small backpack and the raw, gaping wound of a job left unfinished. But now, huddled in her thin coat, her fingers wrapped around a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee from a vending machine. The tears finally came. They welled up, hot and fast, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand, angry at her own weakness. Not out of shame, but because crying in public was a luxury she'd spent a lifetime unlearning in the brutal classrooms of the foster care system. An older woman sitting nearby, her face a roadmap of hard-lived years, watched her for a moment, then leaned over and offered a small packet of tissues without a single word. Aurora managed a watery smile of thanks and looked up at the departures board. The scrolling letters blurred behind her tears. It was cruelly ironic. She had survived far worse than a rich man's rage. She had survived being aged out of the system with $50 and a bus ticket. She had endured the unimaginable pain of losing her own infant son to an illness she couldn't afford to fight. She had been told, time and again, that she was too soft, too sensitive, too broken to handle children with real trauma. But that house, those two little boys with their haunted eyes, they had found a small, locked room deep inside her heart and picked the lock. What do you think of Aurora? If you believe she's a woman of incredible strength, give her a like to show your support, and let us know in the comments where you're watching this story unfold from. You never know who in your own town might be on this journey with you. A bus pulled up to the bay with a loud hiss of air brakes, its destination sign glowing. Savannah. Her ticket, a one-way path back to a life she thought she'd escaped, was a crumpled receipt in her coat pocket. She stood slowly, her body aching, not sure if she could force herself to board. But her heart, her stubborn, foolish heart, was still miles away, upstairs in a grand, lonely mansion in Aspen, where two little boys were finally learning how to sleep through the night. She sat back down on the cold plastic bench. The bus to Savannah could wait. The next morning, Damien stood in his son's room holding a breakfast tray. Scrambled eggs, toast cut into soldiers with the crusts removed, a small bowl of sliced strawberries. He had never done this before. Not once since Isabella died. Mrs. Albright usually handled it. He felt like an intruder in their world. Noah sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His first words were a dagger to Damien's heart. "Where's Miss Aurora?" Damien's throat went dry. Ethan was awake now, too, his gaze sharp and accusatory. "Is she gone?" He could only nod. She had to leave. Why? Noah's voice was small, but it cracked with an impending storm of tears. She didn't do anything bad, Ethan stated, his eyes narrowing with a wisdom far beyond his years. She helped us sleep. You saw. We were being good. Damien sank to his knees beside the bed, placing the untouched tray on the nightstand. It wasn't your fault, he said, the words feeling hollow. It was mine. Noah stared at him, his little face a mask of solemn judgment. Did you yell at her? Damien couldn't lie, not to them. Yes. Did you hit her? Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. Damien's carefully constructed world fractured. He could feel the pieces falling around him. He gave a single, shameful nod. Both boys turned their faces away from him, a silent, unified rejection that was more painful than any corporate takeover or market crash. He stayed there, a powerful man brought to his knees on a carpet patterned with cartoon rockets, for what felt like an eternity. I'll fix it, he whispered to their small, stiff backs. I swear to you, I'll bring her back. They didn't respond, but he knew they'd heard him. Later that day, Aurora boarded a local city bus, not the one to Savannah, and took it to a downtown women's shelter where she used to volunteer before taking the job in Aspen. She needed to be somewhere real, somewhere that reminded her that the world was bigger and more broken than one gilded cage. That afternoon, she found herself leading an impromptu creative writing class for a group of teenage girls, most of them runaways with stories etched on their faces that made hers seem tame. She didn't tell them about Damien or his children. She told them stories about the power of knowing your own worth, even when the world tells you you're worthless, about choosing to stay and fight when every instinct tells you to run. When she left the shelter that evening, she found a note tucked into the spokes of an old bicycle she'd borrowed. It wasn't in Damien's commanding scrawl, but in the shaky block letters of a child. It simply said, "They asked for you. Both of them." She looked up at the sky, now streaked with the fiery oranges and purples of sunset, and this time, when she smiled, there were no tears. It was the smile of a warrior getting ready for battle. Damien Blackwood didn't bother to knock. He simply stepped into the worn-down community center as the sun bled out behind the mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the scuffed gymnasium floor. The crisp, authoritative click of his handmade Italian loafers on the cheap linoleum was jarringly out of place, like a line of Shakespeare quoted at a heavy metal concert. He didn't seem to notice. He swept the room with a gaze accustomed to commanding boardrooms, his eyes finding Aurora at the far end. She was crouched beside a stained whiteboard, wiping away the remnants of a grammar lesson. A circle of teenage girls surrounded her, their laughter echoing in the cavernous space, their notebooks and backpacks strewn around them like fallen leaves. Aurora was laughing with them, a genuine, unburdened sound he hadn't heard before. It wasn't a laugh free of pain, but for a fleeting moment, it was a laugh free of him. He didn't realize his own chest was a knot of tension until her eyes lifted and found his across the gym. The laughter didn't die instantly. It tapered off as the girls sensed the shift in her posture, a subtle drawing in, like a curtain falling mid-act. She stood slowly, wiping the chalk dust from her hands onto her jeans, and he began to walk toward her. His hands were empty. No briefcase, no checkbook, just the crushing, invisible weight of what he had done. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lower than he intended, stripped of its usual authority. The girls eyed him with a fierce, protective suspicion. One of them, a tall girl with a nose ring and haunted eyes, instinctively took a small step in front of Aurora. "It's okay, Zara," Aurora said, her voice a calm reassurance, and the girl reluctantly relaxed her stance, but didn't back down completely. Damien's eyes flickered to the whiteboard behind her. A single, powerful sentence had been left at the top in her neat script. Your voice has value, even when it shakes. He swallowed, the words lodging in his throat. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the door. She gave a curt nod and led him outside to a solitary bench by the bus stop, the very same bench where she had sat just the day before, huddled and heartbroken. The air was cold, carrying the clean scent of pine and impending snow. I was wrong, he began, the words coming out in a rush, devoid of pretext or excuse. I judged you. I reacted without thinking, without listening, and I laid my hands on you. That is an act I will carry with shame for the rest of my days. Aurora said nothing, her gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped peaks. She just listened. I saw you in my space, in my bed, he continued, the words tasting like poison, and I let 2 years of unprocessed grief and fear make my decisions for me. That wasn't just unfair to you. It was monstrously cruel. You didn't believe me, she said finally. Her voice wasn't angry or accusatory. It was simply tired. A statement of fact from a woman who had spent her life not being believed. Even after your own sons had finally begun to trust someone. I know, he breathed, the words heavy with the truth of his failure. She looked away, pulling her worn cardigan tighter. You don't just get to reappear in my life and expect forgiveness because you've had a moment of clarity. My well-being isn't a line item on your list of problems to fix. I'm not here for my own absolution, he said, his voice earnest. I am here because my sons asked for you. They didn't ask for a new nanny. They didn't ask for their father. They asked for you, Aurora. At the mention of their names, a flicker of softness entered her eyes. How are they? Quiet, he admitted, the single word a confession of his complete inadequacy. Too quiet. She nodded slowly, understanding completely. That isn't peace, Damien. That's a wound closing over an infection. It will fester. He looked down at his own hands, clasped tightly between his knees. The hands that had caused this. I want to fix this, he said, the words a raw plea. You can't fix what you broke, she replied, her words sharp but true. But you can start building something new. You can start by acknowledging that what your sons need isn't your control. It's your connection. He exhaled a shaky breath. Come back. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was distant, calculating. Finally, she asked a question he didn't expect. If I do, what is my title? He hesitated. You'll be head of child well-being, advisor, whatever title you want. Your salary will be tripled. She raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. I'm not talking about money. If I come back, will I still be just another member of the staff? The implication hung in the cold air between them. No, he said, meeting her gaze. You'll be a partner. Her eyebrows shot up again. In their care, he clarified quickly, though the word partner lingered, heavier and more significant than he'd intended. Aurora considered his offer, weighing the pain of returning against the needs of 2 small, broken boys. Fine, she said at last, but on my terms. I have conditions. Anything, he said, without a moment's hesitation. First, any and all security cameras in the children's wing of the house are to be dismantled. Immediately. He blinked, surprised. There are no cameras in their rooms. There were, she countered calmly. Your last head of security, a man named Peters, informed the third to last nanny that they were installed for observation. They teach your sons that their privacy is not their own to keep. They teach them they are being watched, not cared for. He looked stunned, but he nodded once. Done. Second, she continued, The three of you will eat dinner together at the kitchen table every night. No phones, no business calls, just you and your sons." He started to protest, his schedule already flashing through his mind. But the look on her face silenced him. He nodded again. "Done." "Third," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We rewrite the rules of the house, together, the four of us." He stared at her, incredulous. "They're 5 years old. And they're people," she shot back, her gaze unwavering. "They deserve a voice in the place they call home." He felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the ghost of a smile. "Anything else?" She took a deep, steadying breath. "Yes. The next time you raise your voice to me in anger, I walk. The next time you raise your hand to anyone who doesn't deserve it, me, your staff, your children, I am gone. And this time there will be no coming back. Ever." His expression sobered instantly. The faint hint of a smile vanished. "Understood," he said, his voice hoarse. She stood, signaling the end of the negotiation. "I'll see the boys in the morning." He rose as well. "Do you need a ride?" She shook her head, pulling her bag over her shoulder. "I'll take the bus. My work here isn't finished yet." He nodded, defeated but grateful. "Aurora, thank you." She paused at the door of the community center. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Blackwood. We're not fixing anything. We're starting over. And this time I will not be walking on eggshells." She turned and disappeared back inside, leaving him alone on the curb as the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall. That night, for the first time in years, Damian Blackwood cleared the dinner table himself. He called his sons downstairs and sat between them at the cavernous dining room table, a pot of spaghetti and a jar of store-bought sauce between them. He tried, awkwardly, to tell them a bedtime story, mixing up the characters, getting the voices all wrong. To his surprise, they laughed at him, not cruelly, just honestly. It was the first time he had heard them laugh in what felt like a lifetime. Later, tucked into their beds, clean and warm, Noah whispered to his brother in the dark. "She's coming back." "How do you know?" Leo asked, his voice muffled by his pillow. "'Cause he said he was sorry," Ethan replied, with the simple, profound logic of a child. "Nobody else ever says sorry." The morning Aurora Jensen returned to the Blackwood estate, the sky was a delicate watercolor of peach and lavender. A flock of birds chirped a vibrant chorus from the snow-dusted branches of the aspen trees, and the vast, manicured lawn, blanketed in white, sparkled under the rising sun. She paused for a long moment at the foot of the wrought-iron gates, before they silently swung open, her hands gripping the straps of her well-worn canvas bag as if it were a shield. Everything looked precisely the same, a perfect, untouched photograph. But nothing felt the same. The butler, Harold, a man whose face was a study in dignified impassivity, greeted her at the door. He blinked once, a barely perceptible flicker of astonishment, before stepping aside with a slight bow that held more respect than she'd ever seen him give anyone. "Miss Jensen," he said, and for the first time, she detected a hint of warmth in his formal tone. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Harold," she replied, her voice steady as she stepped past the gleaming marble floors and the ridiculously oversized crystal chandelier. The silence that had once felt so oppressive now seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. From upstairs she heard it, the thudding of small, quick feet, running with an urgency that made her heart ache. Then a shout, clear and joyous. "She's here!" Noah rounded the top of the grand staircase first, a blur of flannel pajamas and uncombed hair, his arms flung wide and a grin splitting his face. Leo followed a beat behind, more cautious but with eyes shining so brightly They seemed to illuminate the whole foyer, clutching a familiar sketchbook to his chest. Aurora dropped to her knees just in time to catch Noah as he launched himself into her arms, burying his face in her shoulder. "Well, hello there, little man," she laughed, the sound muffled by his curls. "We made you a welcome-back picture," Leo said shyly, holding out the sketchbook. On the first page was a wonderfully wobbly crayon drawing of a smiling woman with big hair, 2 small boys, and a very large house with a giant red heart floating above it like a balloon. The caption beneath, in careful block letters, read, "You stayed, even when you left." Aurora's throat constricted, a knot of emotion so tight she could barely breathe. "Oh, honey," she whispered, tracing the lopsided heart with her finger. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Thank you." The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approached from behind them. Damien stood at the base of the stairs, not in one of his immaculate power broker suits, but in a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man who was actively, painfully, trying. "Breakfast is ready," he said, his voice even. Aurora stood, gently disentangling herself from Noah and smoothing her blouse. "Good," she said, meeting Damien's gaze with a look that was both determined and fair. "Because we have some rules to rewrite." In the sun-drenched breakfast nook, a room they had never once used, the 4 of them gathered around a small, round table. There were no staff hovering, no phones buzzing on the counter, just a platter of pancakes, a bowl of fresh berries, and a pitcher of orange juice. "Okay," Aurora began, pulling a crisp new notebook from her bag. "We are going to make a new agreement for how we live in this house. Together. We're going to talk about what feels fair, what feels safe, and what will make this place finally feel like a home for everyone." Leo, ever the thoughtful one, raised a tentative hand. Can we have music during bath time?" Aurora nodded, writing it down. "Excellent rule, absolutely," Noah chimed in, emboldened. "And no more broccoli, unless it's hidden in cheese." Damien coughed to hide a laugh. "I might require a subcommittee meeting on the definition of hidden." Aurora smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "We'll add it to the list. But this isn't just about broccoli and music. It's about boundaries." She looked pointedly at Damien. "For all of us." He met her gaze and held it, his expression sober. "Understood." For the next hour, a revolution took place in that kitchen. The boys, armed with crayons, scribbled out their demands. Always knock before entering a room. No yelling after the sun goes down. Hugs must be asked for first. Pancakes are mandatory on Sundays. And 2 stories each, no exceptions, before lights out. Maya added her own rules to the list in neat, clear print. Listen first, speak second. Apologize when you are wrong. No secrets. Finally, Damien took the pen and added a single line in his elegant, decisive handwriting. "Make space for forgiveness, even when it's hard." When they were finished, Aurora took the single sheet of paper and taped it to the front of the enormous stainless steel refrigerator with 2 silly, smiling, sun-shaped magnets. "There," she declared, stepping back, "the Constitution of House Blackwood." Later that afternoon, while the boys were outside with Mrs. Albright building a snowman, Damien found Aurora in the library. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by piles of children's books, sorting them into categories. "They've changed since you left," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Even in just a day." She glanced up from a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. "Or maybe," she countered gently, "they were always this capable of joy, and no one ever gave them the space to show it. I've changed too," he said, the words quiet, hesitant. She held his gaze, not letting him look away. I believe that's possible. He took a step into the room. What you did. Staying away to protect yourself, but then coming back for them. That was more grace than I deserved. Aurora stood, placing the book back on a low shelf. Perhaps. But it's exactly what they deserved. And I refuse to let your worst moment become their life's lesson. He flinched at the directness of her words, but accepted them with a nod. I want to be a better man, a better father. Then start by being present, she said, her voice softening slightly. Truly present. Not just when it's convenient or easy, when it's messy and hard and you'd rather be anywhere else. He looked down, the familiar shadow of shame crossing his features. Do you think, will they ever forgive me for what happened? Damien, she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name with such ease. They're children. Their hearts are built for forgiveness. They already have. The real question is, can you forgive yourself? Because you have to keep earning their trust every single day. That evening, for the first time since Isabella's passing, Damien tucked his sons into bed himself. He read them a story about a brave knight and a goofy dragon doing all the voices badly. Maya stood in the doorway, unseen, listening as the boys' giggles filled the hallway, correcting his mispronunciations and begging for, "Just one more page, Dad." After lights out, Damien walked Aurora to the guest wing of the house. I was thinking, he said, his voice uncertain, about what you said before, about not being staff, about being a partner. She crossed her arms, a playful glint in her eye. You're not about to offer me a corner office, are you? He almost smiled. No, I was going to offer you a legacy. She tilted her head, confused. I want you to help me build something, not just for them, but for other children like them. Children who have lost a piece of their world, a piece of themselves, a foundation. Aurora's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. You're serious? He nodded, his gaze intense. Completely. A real, tangible resource. Something meaningful. I'll provide the funding. You provide the heart. She stared at him for a long, searching moment, seeing not the arrogant billionaire who had hurt her, but the grieving father who was desperately trying to heal. If we do this, she said finally, it's done on our terms. No splashy media campaigns. No self-congratulatory galas for your rich friends. It's about the work. Only the work. Agreed, he said without hesitation. She extended her hand. Then we have a deal, Mr. Blackwood. He took her hand, his grasp warm and firm. Call me Damien. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that transformed her entire face. All right, Damien. That night, as she settled into the guest room, her own designated space, a room that was no longer temporary, she paused outside the boy's door. From within, she heard a soft whisper. She came back, Leo, Noah said, his voice drowsy with sleep. I told you she would, Leo replied. And Aurora, leaning her forehead gently against the cool wood of the door, whispered back to herself. I did. 3 weeks after Aurora's return, the Blackwood estate felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a low, joyful hum of life. Breakfasts were a chaotic symphony of spilled juice and pancake negotiations. Bath times were filled with splashing and off-key singing, and the two boys, once as brittle and withdrawn as winter branches, had begun to bloom like resilient mountain wildflowers. The Constitution on the refrigerator was now smudged with fingerprints and had a few new crayon-scrawled amendments. And Damien, the formidable patriarch, was discovering the humbling art of making a decent grilled cheese and attempting, with disastrous results, to braid Mrs. Albright's hair at her laughing insistence. But healing is not a linear path. Late one Friday night, long after the boys were asleep and the house had settled into a comfortable quiet, Aurora found herself wandering the cavernous halls. She often did this when the ghosts of her own past pressed too close, the silent house a canvas for her thoughts. Tonight, however, something felt different. A thin line of light sliced through the darkness from under the library door, which was usually kept locked. She pushed it open noiselessly. Damien was inside, slumped in the oversized leather chair behind his massive desk. He held his phone in one hand, its screen glowing ominously, and a half-empty tumbler of scotch in the other. He was so lost in whatever he was reading that he didn't hear her enter. "Bad news?" she asked softly. He started, looking up with a jolt. "Aurora, I'm sorry, I was just... You're 2 inches from a decanter of bourbon on a Friday night," she said gently. "I'm guessing it's not a celebratory email." He set the glass down with a heavy thud and cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Just an email." She simply waited, her silence a more effective interrogation than any words could be. Finally, with a sigh of defeat, he turned the phone's screen toward her. The subject line was stark and brutal. "Custody hearing. Notice of motion." Aurora's breath hitched. "Custody hearing? For Leo and Noah?" He nodded, his jaw set like granite. "Isabella's parents, the Vanderbilts. They've filed a motion for temporary guardianship. They're claiming I'm an unfit parent." "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Neglect, emotional instability, and, as their private investigator so kindly detailed in a sworn affidavit, a recent domestic incident involving a member of my staff." Aurora's face went cold. "They found out about what happened, about me." "Apparently," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "They've been watching, just waiting for an opportunity. Now that the boys are finally showing signs of life, now that we have some semblance of stability, they want to swoop in and tear it all away." She sank into the chair opposite him. "Have they ever been a significant part of the boys' lives?" "Not since the funeral," he said, his voice raw. "They've always blamed me for Isabella's, for her depression. They said I worked too much, that I pushed her away, that I buried her too quickly and didn't allow the boys to grieve properly." He looked away, his gaze finding a dark corner of the room. Maybe. Maybe they weren't entirely wrong about some of it. Aurora was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Do you want me to testify? I can talk about the changes I've seen in the boys, in you. I've been keeping journals." Damien hesitated, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "I don't know if your testimony helps me or buries me. They'll use you as proof that I can't parent them on my own." "Then maybe we don't fight them on your own," she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, steely conviction. "Maybe we don't play their game. Maybe we show the court what a healing family actually looks like, not what a perfect one is supposed to." His eyes, shadowed with fear and despair, met hers. "You would do that? You'd get on a stand, in a court of law, and talk about this? After everything I did?" "I would do it for them," Aurora said, her voice unequivocal. "Not for your reputation, not for appearances. For Leo, and for Noah." He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and some of the crushing tension seemed to seep out of his rigid frame. "Do you really think I can win this?" She rose and walked to the enormous window, looking out into the inky blackness where, in the distance, a single warm light glowed from the nursery window. "You won't win if you walk into that courtroom as the man who slapped his nanny. But you will win if you go in as the man who knelt on the floor and apologized, the man who relearned how to be a father, the man who finally showed up." He nodded slowly, a flicker of resolve hardening his gaze. Then I'll show up. The next morning, the house was alive with a quiet, focused energy. Aurora spent hours reviewing her journals, carefully documenting the twins' progress, their sleep patterns, their emotional breakthroughs, their increasingly positive interactions with their father. She gathered their recent art projects, took pictures of the proudly displayed refrigerator Constitution, and printed out a photo of a drawing Leo had made just the day before. 4 stick figures, 2 large, 2 small, holding hands under a lopsided rainbow. No one had told him to draw it. He had just drawn what was becoming his truth. Meanwhile, Damien was on the phone with his legal team, scheduling an emergency strategy session. For the first time in his life, his instructions were not about mitigating financial risk or managing public relations. They were about protecting 2 little boys who had already lost their mother and were in danger of losing their father, too. At lunchtime, Aurora sat with the twins under the ancient oak tree in the backyard, its branches bare against the winter sky. She was cutting their grilled cheese sandwiches into triangles when Eli asked, his small voice almost stolen by the wind. "Do we have to go live with Grandma and Grandpa Vanderbilt?" Aurora's hands stilled. "Why would you ask something like that, sweetie?" "I heard Daddy on the phone this morning," Leo said, his expression serious. "He was yelling. They don't like him very much." Aurora pushed her plate aside and gathered them close. "Boys, look at me. No one is taking you anywhere. Your father and we are going to fight to make sure you stay right here. And I am not going anywhere either. That's a promise." "But they're rich," Leo pointed out with childlike pragmatism. "And they're, family." Aurora was taken aback by the weight of that word from his lips. She leaned in, cupping Eli's small, cold chin in her hand. "Let me tell you both something really important. Family isn't something you're born into with the same last name. It's not about blood. It's built. It's built by the people who stay when things get hard, the people who fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. And I am right here. That makes me family, understand?" Noah wrapped his small arms around her neck, his hug fierce and tight. "Then you better win," he mumbled into her coat. Aurora looked up at the house. Damien was standing in the window of his study, watching them. Their eyes met across the snow-covered lawn. He gave a single, solemn nod. They were going to war. That night, Aurora sat at the small desk in her room, typing up her official statement for the court. It wasn't a formal legal document, filled with jargon and loopholes. It was just the truth, written from the heart. She described the hollow, silent boys she had first met. She wrote about the screaming fits in the middle of the night, the terror in their eyes, the heartbreaking way they would reach for her hand and then snatch it back, as if afraid to hope. And then she wrote about the slow, fragile dawn of their healing, the first tentative laugh, the first full night of sleep, the first time they called for Dad instead of for her. At the very bottom of the page, she typed one final paragraph. "Healing does not happen in a straight line. It is a messy, unpredictable, and often painful process. But in this house, over these past weeks, I have had the profound privilege of witnessing 2 small boys begin to stitch their broken hearts back together. This is not happening because of money, or legacy, or blood ties. It is happening because their father chose to change, and because someone else chose to stay." She printed it, placed it in a simple manila folder, and left it on Damien's desk for his lawyers to see. As she turned to leave his study, she glanced back at the note he had once kept. Her handwriting, still taped to the corner of a photo frame. "If you can't be present for them." She smiled, a small, tired but resolute smile, because now, finally, no one was pushing away, and everyone was staying. The courthouse was a cavern of polished marble and palpable anxiety, Its grandiose columns stood like silent, impassive judges, and the morning sun, streaming through towering arched windows, cast long, golden bars across the floor. Aurora sat on a hard wooden bench beside Damien in the echoing waiting area. They were a study in muted resolve. Him in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that seemed more like armor than clothing. Her in a simple, soft navy dress. The sleeves were just long enough to cover a faint, silvery scar on her wrist, a memento from a night 2 weeks ago when both boys had woken up screaming from the same nightmare, and she had accidentally caught her arm on a bedside lamp in the ensuing chaos. Damien glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Nervous? Aurora kept her gaze fixed on the courtroom door across the hall. Only about the things I can't control. Across from them sat the Vanderbilts, James and Eleanor, draped in the kind of old money affluence that serves as its own impenetrable fortress. Eleanor wore a Chanel suit the color of cream, a string of perfect pearls at her throat, and a stare so cold and disapproving it could curdle milk. James looked less composed, his knuckles white as he gripped the head of a silver cane, his eyes darting toward Damien with a contempt that was practically vibrating. They hadn't looked at Aurora, not even once. To them, she was less than a ghost. She was simply invisible. The door to courtroom 5 swung open, and a bailiff with a world-weary face called out, "Blackwood versus Vanderbilt." Aurora stood, took a deep breath, and straightened her shoulders, whispering to herself, "This is for Leo and Noah." Inside, the courtroom was even colder than the hallway. The judge, perched behind a mountain of a bench, was an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair swept into a severe bun. Her nameplate read, Honorable Serafina Vargas. Damien's lawyer, a calm, seasoned man named Mr. Fields, spoke first. His tone was measured, respectful, weaving a narrative of a family shattered by sudden, unimaginable tragedy. He spoke of Damien's immense grief, his initial struggle to parent alone, and his recent dedicated efforts to create a stable, loving home for his sons. He highlighted the consistent therapy sessions, the documented progress at their preschool, and, most significantly, the invaluable therapeutic presence of Miss Aurora Jensen. Then, Eleanor Vanderbilt took the stand. Her voice was as polished as her pearls, but it trembled with a carefully suppressed rage. "We only want what is best for our grandchildren," she began, dabbing at a non-existent tear with a lace handkerchief. "What kind of environment is it for 2 traumatized children to be raised by a man who cannot cope? A man who hires a completely unqualified, unvetted stranger to be their primary caregiver? A man who, by his own legal team's admission, assaulted this very woman in his own home?" Aurora sat perfectly still, though she could feel the phantom burn on her cheek. "And she isn't even family," Eleanor added, her voice tightening with disdain, delivering the line as if it were the final, irrefutable blow. Judge Vargas raised a questioning eyebrow. "Miss Jensen is not the one on trial here, Mrs. Vanderbilt. But her presence is the entire issue," Eleanor insisted, her composure cracking. "Damien cannot adequately care for his own children. He is forced to outsource their emotional and psychological needs to someone else, someone temporary, unrelated, and with absolutely no professional training. She has no degrees in child development, no license, no credentials whatsoever." The judge turned her piercing gaze to Aurora. "Miss Jensen, do you have a response to that?" Aurora stood and walked toward the bench, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. She carried no notes. She needed none. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "Mrs. Vanderbilt is correct. I do not have a degree in child psychology, but I have a lifetime degree in surviving pain I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I know what it looks like when children lose their faith in the world, because I was one of those children." She paused, letting the words settle. When I first arrived at the Blackwood home, Leo and Noah did not speak to anyone but each other, and even then, only in whispers. They didn't sleep through the night. They didn't laugh. They didn't trust their father, their staff, or even themselves. But slowly, painstakingly, they began to let me in. Not because I am a miracle worker, but because of one simple, profound act. I stayed. I didn't quit when they screamed at me. I didn't leave when it got hard. I looked them in their terrified eyes and said, with my actions, not just my words, "You matter. Your fear is real, and I am not going anywhere." She met Eleanor's furious gaze, then James's. "You say I'm unqualified. But I ask you, what truly qualifies a person to love a child that isn't their own? To choose to show up for them, day after day, without the obligation of blood? I believe it is the willingness to see their pain and not look away. I have done that. Not for a paycheck, Your Honor. Not for praise. But because 2 little boys were drowning and someone had to be willing to jump into the water with them." Judge Vargas leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Ms. Jensen. You may be seated." Aurora returned to her chair. Beneath the table, out of sight, Damien reached over and squeezed her hand, a silent message of gratitude that spoke volumes. Later that afternoon, after all testimony had been heard, Judge Vargas addressed the court. This court does not entertain custody challenges lightly, particularly when initiated by extended family against a grieving, surviving parent. After reviewing all the provided documentation and listening to the testimony, it is this court's opinion that while Mr. Damien Blackwood has admittedly made significant errors in judgment, he has also taken immediate, consistent, and meaningful steps to rectify those errors and heal his family. His sons are not just surviving. They are beginning to thrive under his care, in no small part due to the stable and compassionate support provided by Ms. Jensen. She fixed her gaze on the Vanderbilts. This court sees no legitimate grounds to remove these children from the custody of their father. Petition for temporary guardianship is denied. A sharp, strangled gasp escaped Eleanor's lips. James placed a restraining hand on her wrist. "Eleanor, let it go." Aurora sat still, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face was a mask of calm composure. It was over. Outside, in the crisp mountain air, Damien turned to her, his face etched with a relief so profound it seemed to have aged him and made him younger all at once. "You saved them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Again." She shook her head. "No, Damien. We did. You showed up. You stayed in the room and owned your truth." Back at the estate, the boys were waiting, curled up on the sofa with Mrs. Albright, who was reading them a comic book in a surprisingly dramatic baritone. When Damien and Aurora walked through the door, Noah was the first to scramble to his feet. "Did we win?" he asked, his voice a tiny, hopeful whisper. Aurora knelt down, opening her arms. "We did, sweetheart. We did." Leo wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her dress. "Does that mean you're never, ever leaving again?" Aurora kissed the top of his head, her own eyes filling with tears. "I am exactly where I belong." That night, as they tucked the boys into bed, Damien stood in the doorway, watching as Aurora hummed a soft, nameless lullaby. When she finally stepped out into the hallway, he said quietly, "I've never been very good at saying thank you." "Then don't say it," she replied, her voice soft. "Just keep showing up." He nodded, his eyes clearer and lighter than she had ever seen them before. "Tomorrow," he said, a new energy in his voice. "Tomorrow we start building that foundation. I've already got architects scheduled to meet with us." She smiled. "And the name?" He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. The Blackwood Jensen Center for Healing. Aurora blinked, caught completely off guard. That's a lot. It's the truth, he said simply. You built this new life right alongside us. She looked past him, into the dimly lit room where his sons, their sons, now slept, finally safe from the monsters, both real and imagined. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of a painful chapter. Maybe it was the beginning of a whole new story.